Hello, friends. Welcome to the ATC Double Cut. I am really excited about the guest today. It is Dr. Bryan Hopkins from the Brigham Young University. Welcome to the show, Dr. Hopkins.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I I think this is the first time we've met. This is a virtual meeting, but I don't know. I don't know that we've ever met at any conferences or met in person, have we?
Not that I can think of, but I have a horrible memory, so maybe.
Well, I don't often go to the United States. I'm from the United States, but I don't spend so much time there. I'm in southern Thailand right now, so I do a lot of reading and listening and watching and observing and studying from afar, which with modern technology that makes it so possible to do. So I follow some of the work that you do, and in 2018, I was so impressed with an article that you wrote with Tyler Hopkins. And I'm going to ask you: are you related to Tyler Hopkins?
Yeah, Tyler is my son, and in addition to being a professor, I also am part of a family company, and Tyler works full time for the company. And he helps me with all aspects of our research and writing. So yeah, that's
Oh,
Tyler.
okay. Well, that is good to know. I've been curious about that ever since I read the is it the byline in the article? The article is, let's see, are we, all right, here we go. Yeah, the article is called. It has a title: "Carbon: The Next Frontier in Fertilization?" Question mark, and it's by Bryan Hopkins and Tyler Hopkins. So I was always wondering who is Tyler Hopkins? Is it your brother? Is it your son? Is it somebody who just has a similar name? So that's cool. So I read that in 2018. It's in the crop and soils crop and soils magazine that's published by the American Society of Agronomy. And as I was mentioning to you, I put a blog post up about that, and I gave the blog post the title, "Is Carbon the Next Frontier in Fertilization?" And I took all that this article, or sorry, all that my blog post is quotes from your article. I didn't really add anything to it. Well, ever since 2018, this has been one of the top posts on the website. And I have been so surprised that over the past 6 years, that this is a topic that so many people are reading about. And I thought, man, wouldn't it be cool if I could talk with you a little bit about this and and just kind of figure out what's going on with this? Because to me, I thought you stated it so well in the article. You said that the well, I'll read the quote. You said, "Should we be applying carbon fertilizer? The answer is no. Although the carbon content of the atmosphere is far less than 1%, plants capture it efficiently. It is their mission in life. As a rule, plants are not carbon deficient." So I thought that like stated it so clearly. And from my education at Oregon State and then graduate school at Cornell University, we kind of learned that plants take carbon from the atmosphere and they make carbohydrates and they grow. So I never really thought about adding carbon fertilizer. So this article I thought was really well written to explain that. So I'm kind of curious, uh, what prompted you to write the article on that particular topic?
I just began to notice over the years just an increasing number of advertisements and sessions at meetings that I was at talking about carbon fertilization. And I just would recoil a little bit because of the misunderstandings that are part of that. And some people were literally thinking, yeah, we need to, fertilize with carbon. It's almost 50% of the plant dry matter. And so, sure, we should be adding it, but it's just not true. And now there are some carbon based compounds that some of these folks, that's what they really meant. So to me, it was at worst a falsehood, and at best a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation of saying that, yeah, I'm going to be fertilizing with carbon. Like, for example, if I'm adding a humic acid, there might be a legitimate reason to do that. There's quite a few folks, though, that would call that carbon fertilization. I would not. I think that we need to be more precise in our language. And so this was my effort to try to kind of combat both of those issues.
Well, good job. I found it to be a powerful article, and you use such good examples because you mentioned humic acid as a type of you know you could call that a carbon fertilizer, but that wouldn't be accurate. But you could also call urea a carbon fertilizer, and then you brought up glyphosate, which is not a fertilizer, but you could call that a carbon fertilizer too, I guess, because all of those compounds, glyphosate, urea, humic acid, they all have carbon in them. And you suggested in the article that we should be a little bit more careful with our terminology.
Yeah, precisely.
So, for anybody who hasn't read this yet, if you want a link, if you want the full article and you can't access it, I can I can get you a copy of that, or you can read some of the key quotes on my website. I think I want to read a couple more of the quotes from here that I thought were really good, and talk about some of the research that you summarized in this article also. You said that plants are a factory of sorts whose byproduct is a carbon-containing sugar with oxygen gas as a byproduct. And you also wrote, what about applying solid forms of carbon to the soil? This is doable and promoted at an alarming rate. There are a wide variety of compounds on the earth that contain carbon, but is it wise to add them as fertilizer? It is true that many compounds containing carbon have been documented to positively impact plants. A notable example is urea fertilizer, which contains 1 atom of carbon for every 2 atoms of nitrogen. And then you talked about some of the research that you've done. You said that you've conducted more than 24 trials over 2 decades on a variety of species, from turfgrass to row crops, comparing nothing added or a negative control versus various carbon fertilizers. And because the carbon fertilizers, which you put in quotes, also contained other nutrients, you did another trial. You did a nutrient concentration that matched what was in the carbon containing product, and you compared that as a positive control. And so what was the results of that? Can you describe like what those experiments are, and kind of what the general result was?
Yeah, and we've done more since, and we've learned more since I wrote this article. But yeah, so one of the problems out there is people not doing good science, and so they go out there and they apply, a compost material that's got carbon in it, and and they're calling it carbon fertilization. Well, what's giving the plant response? Is the nitrogen? Probably the nitrogen and some of the other nutrients. And so, in order to truly do at work and say, did carbon benefit or was it something else? You have to have true controls. So we have negative control with nothing, but then the positive control is that it's basically a replica of that carbon fertilizer. It's got all of the other nutrients except carbon, and that way it's a legitimate way of evaluating that. Now, sometimes, we have got some responses sometimes, like with humic acid, for example. That's one that I've actually had the most luck with. In that, so, and what we've done, like for example, I did some potato research where I found that adding humic acid with phosphorus fertilizer actually increased the amount of phosphorus in the plant. And so I would argue that it wasn't carbon that gave the benefit. The humic acid has a carbon backbone, and that was the vehicle for delivering the phosphorus, but it was truly a phosphorus response. Now, there's other studies that have been done, mostly by other people. I've done a couple, but showing like a biostimulant response at times with a humic acid. So there's certainly those kinds of things out there, but is it a carbon response? No, it's not. Our data clearly showed that when we separated out those things, it was something else besides carbon that was giving us a plant response.
Thank you for that explanation. And I think didn't you suggest that when you like not talking about carbon, but talking about humic acid and phosphorus availability, wouldn't that tend to be more likely to see an effect at some extreme pH values where the phosphorus solubility in the soil may not be so high?
Yeah, and we should do a podcast on that someday because I've just been abused with that. I did a bunch of phosphorus humic acid research. I'm in the West, and our soils are calcareous, low organic matter soils, and phosphorus availability and solubility in those soils is pretty low. And we tend to see a response to phosphorus when you wouldn't in a like a neutral pH or even in slightly acidic soil. So yeah, that extreme pH can really make a difference. But what happens is people take my research in these type of soils and they just try to extrapolate it to everything else, including trying to say, oh, this works in turf grass, and maybe it does, and maybe it doesn't, or it works in other crops. I don't. I About 50% of my research is turf grass, and the other 50% is crops, and so I work with a lot of different species. But yeah, you really need to understand the conditions in which the research was done, and not just wildly extrapolate. And humic acid just really gets a lot of sales, and my responses to it are limited. I think it's a good product when used right in the right conditions, but it's not just something that should be applied to every acre out there.
Do you know, like, there's so many humic acid products on the market. Is it a byproduct of some industrial process that just makes so much of it available? Do you know where does humic acid generally come from? The stuff that's in the jugs.
Yeah, the vast majority of it is mined. It's leonardite is a mineral that's in soil. It comes from ancient deposits of organic material, plants, and possibly other things too, but mostly plants. And anyway, you can form that leonardite, and then companies will go in and extract it. And it's hard to get a specific chemical uh, uh, characterization of it because it changes from one batch to another, or even one molecule to another. There's different functional groups, and so humic acid is kind of this big nebulous thing. It's not like urea that's a very precise molecule, and I know exactly what the percentages of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen are in it. um, and But humic acid is a lot of different things. So that's one thing too, is when I buy humic acid, it can be a fairly wide range of functionality and effectiveness. And so working with a reputable company that's got a product that's consistent, I think it's one of the important things that when using a humic acid. And I've had some really good luck with it. I really have had works with some companies that have some good products, but I've also worked with some products that were, kind of hit and miss. They weren't consistent from one batch to the next.
And are you talking now? Are you more likely to see a response on agricultural crops, or more likely to see a response on turf grass?
I'll be honest with you. I haven't seen a lot of response to humic acid with turf grass. I have seen some. I've had a few instances where I had really like typically a new planting, recently seeded or sodded grass and low organic matter more likely to get a response. Alkaline conditions or calcareous soils are more likely to get a response. And of course, most of my work is in that world, so
Mm-hmm.
I'm not as informed on acid soils. But yeah, I haven't had tons of response. In fact, I'd say most of the time in turf grass, I have not seen a response. Um, More likely, like potato would be one that was just potatoes just really has a hard time taking up phosphorus. It's shallow rooted. It's got inefficient root system. It needs a lot of phosphorus, and so the odds of getting a response on that species is pretty high. In contrast, turfgrass has a very fibrous root system. It tends to explore the topsoil where most of my phosphorus is resident, and it's pretty good. I have a really hard time showing responses to phosphorus fertilizer in turfgrass because of that. I know we do get them. I mean, we can get conditions where we definitely need to add phosphorus, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, especially again new seedlings, new sod. When I don't have that established root system, I got a pretty high probability of response to phosphorus. But on an established grass that's got that good root system, I just really have a hard time seeing a response to phosphorus, and I would add humic acid to that. So I can just add straight phosphorus. Adding the humic acid with the phosphorus is what I would call an enhanced efficiency product, and I can use less of it for one thing, and I'm more likely to get a response because it improves the solubility. One of the nice things about humic acid and phosphorus is that it makes the phosphorus more mobile. So we've got data that shows that phosphorus normally is not mobile in the soil, just kind of sits wherever you apply it in most situations, not all situations, but most. But when I couple that with a humic acid molecule, it'll allow that phosphorus to move. So in a permanent sod situation or an orchard, where we're not using tillage to get the phosphorus moved into the soil, the humic acid can be a benefit. It can get it down to that lower part of the soil with that the plants can benefit, and that's true for permanent sod that's a turf grass.
That leads to something I hadn't ever thought of before. You may be aware that creeping bentgrass has tends to have a more extensive root system than Poa annua, and there's some research that shows that Poa annua will suffer more from basically, you could favor creeping bentgrass over Poa annua in a mixed stand if the soil phosphorus gets low enough. But you also mentioned that phosphorus tends to stay near the surface, which is also where the Poa annua roots are. And I just wonder if you do inherit, let's say you've got a golf course putting green, it's got Poa annua and creeping bentgrass on it. You inherit that, and you inherit a relatively high phosphorus content at the top of the root zone. Could simply applying humic acid and water assist? Could that more rapidly decrease the phosphorus at the top of the root zone by causing that phosphorus to move down a bit? Do you think there's some potential for that?
I think there's a potential for that. That's really interesting thinking. Yeah, I have never put those two things together, so that's an interesting hypothesis, and it very well could. I, I haven't had much luck with adding humic acid without the phosphorus. Like Um, I suspect, I don't know, I just suspect that it doesn't really grab the phosphorus and bond with it, form a chemical bond with it as effectively. Like if I mix that, or even better, if it's manufactured and we're forcing a bond to be created, um, that is more likely. Whereas if I, and again, I don't know this for sure, but if I add phosphorus, or excuse me, if I add humic acid to the soil, is it going to go in there and bond with phosphorus and then move it down? I don't know, but it's possible, and that's something that I'd be, poanas are bane of our existence, what I always say. And if we, that sounds like a great research project that we should be doing. Somebody needs to do that.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. I I think there's a lot of potential. You see in Europe with a lot of the chemical restrictions, they start trying all kinds of innovative things to try to manage with less less pesticides or with no pesticides. And I've been surprised sometimes at how good the surfaces can be with some interesting management. So yeah, we have to think outside the box a little bit.
Yeah, I would just want to reiterate what you said, though. You're absolutely right about the phosphorus in the annual bluegrass. I mean, that's a reason not to build your phosphorus levels up to be, and what I find, in fact, I just am getting ready to publish a study of a survey of, it's not golf, it's sports fields, but on average, we're just far, far too high, and we just go out and apply it, whether we need it or not, and that favors annual bluegrass. And we it's a lesson that seems like all of us should pay attention to. I mean, it's well known fact that of what you said is that we shouldn't be driving those phosphorus levels up, because if we do, it favors the poana.
Yeah, and it's persistent because once you drive it up, and once excuse me, once Poa annua gets a foothold, once Poa annua is present and producing seed in your stand, you've kind of lost the battle.
Yeah,
And and yet, if you can keep it out and you can keep the phosphorus low enough so that your desired species has enough and it doesn't favor Poa annua, you can certainly prolong the time at which you have the desired species dominating. So, yeah, well,
sure.
that's interesting. That it gets a little bit away from our carbon carbon fertilizer topic. Let's get back to that. I have a couple more things I wanted to highlight in this. I just I encourage everyone, if you're not familiar with this, there's a reason why it's one of the top posts on the ATC website. Um, this is just such a powerful article, and I didn't write any words of it. It's just quotes from your article. Um, but you said, yeah, the so-called, so summarizing those research projects, he said the so-called carbon fertilizer did not impact carbon status in the plant in any case. And then the kind of the joke about glyphosate, you wrote, to further illustrate this point, many compounds containing carbon have been documented to negatively impact plants. A notable example is glyphosate herbicide. It is erroneous to conclude that the carbon is what kills plants. And you're referring to the carbon in the glyphosate molecule. Yes, carbon is part of the molecule, but it is the entire sum of the parts that makes this molecule effective and not any individual atom. And the final paragraph was summed up. It says, forget about fertilizing with carbon. Use products proven scientifically in replicated research via unbiased third party sources. Some of these will be carbon based and others will not. In general, whether it's urea or glyphosate, the presence of carbon is an important part of the sum of the molecule's effectiveness, but carbon nutrition is not the reason for the response. And I just thought that was such a powerful article. I wonder, have you received any feedback or much feedback over the past 6 years since publishing that, positive or negative, about the content of that article?
Yeah, a lot of feedback, and people reaching out and asking questions, and like I didn't realize this, and just trying to get some clarification on, what about this and what about that. So I get a lot of those kinds of phone calls, people asking me about products, and if I've got research, I do a lot of research. I look at a lot of products. I don't look at all of them, and so sometimes I'm talking about, yes, I've worked with that one, and here's what I think. And in other cases, I'm just speculating because I'm just looking at the label and trying to say, well, and trying to see, does this company have any research? But again, sometimes they're showing a response, and I'm just trying to decide. It's like, well, why did you get a response? Because most of the research that's done on these products isn't done correctly, with a positive and negative control. And and then so like I'm looking at it, I'm like, well, it's possible that it was some of the other nutrients that were in that material, or it was a biostimulant response. I mean, but the whole biostimulant world is, man, that's a tough one, because sometimes, in my experience, and others, some other respected folks that I have a lot of, I think they know what they're talking about. If I have a well managed system that I don't have a lot of stress, I don't really see a lot of response to these biostimulants. But I get some stress, heat stress, salt stress. I'm more likely to see a biostimulant response. So sometimes these so-called carbon fertilizers, I'm actually getting some kind of a biostimulation. And so I'm not saying that these products can't work. It's just, let's be more careful in our terminology and not call it carbon fer. I hate that phrase. Since it's like, no, it's not carbon fertilizer. And yet you still, if you do a Google search right now, you're going to find a whole bunch of carbon fertilizers out there. And I just think it's misrepresentation of the truth.
Yeah, it seems like it's something that for whatever reason it's a type of language or a marketing phrase that resonates with people, and people think it's good somehow, and they're not. Yeah, it's just something that people like, and yet it's just the wrong way to think about what's going on. And I think it's interesting in the turf grass industry, and maybe not so much in lawn care. Probably so in sports turf, although I don't have a huge amount of experience with that, but definitely in golf, and especially on sand-capped root zones or sand-based root zones, people are terribly concerned about getting too much organic matter accumulation. And so a lot of work is done. A lot of articles are written. A lot of seminars are attended to figure out how to keep your organic matter low, how to add enough top dressing, how to make sure you're adding enough top dressing that has zero organic matter in it so that you can dilute the organic matter that's already in the soil. How much core aerification should you do, or solid tine aerification, and fill those holes with sand, or dry eject to put sand in, all for the purpose of removing or diluting the organic matter in the soil. Sorry, we I got a temporary disconnect, but I think we're still here. Are you still
Yeah,
there, Bryan?
I can hear you now. Yeah, I lost you for a minute.
Okay, cool. So it's interesting that we do all this work to try to remove organic matter or manage organic matter in the soil, and we can think of that. We could equivalently say that we're managing carbon in the soil, reducing carbon in the soil, and then at the same time to be excited about adding carbon. Why would we ever want to add carbon to the soil when so much focus of the management is how to remove carbon or keep carbon from getting too high in the soil? Have you thought about that kind of contradiction? And don't what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because organic matter and carbon are synonymous in many ways. And it's organic matter is about 58% carbon, um, and And in most situations, I want to build organic matter, but notably, as you said, sports turf and golf, especially sand-based systems, it's harmful to us for various reasons. So we're yeah, so yeah. Why are we all of a sudden excited about building up carbon, and we're simultaneously trying to drive organic matter down? It doesn't make it just does. It's part of the narrative of not making sense of what's being promoted. I've even thought about, it's like, hey, I'm going to start selling hydrogen fertilization, because hydrogen is also, one of those non-mineral nutrients that's needed by plants. Plants are about 5% hydrogen. So I think I could just bottle up some water and start selling it at high dollar values and call it hydrogen fertilization.
Yeah, you could have
Just
a
really,
third,
like,
yeah, have
yeah,
another
plants need
family
hydrogen.
business.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously plants need hydrogen, but it's ubiquitous in the environment. If as long as that plant's got enough water and it's got normal conditions, it's not hydrogen deficient. So it's the same argument for carbon. The other non-mineral nutrient is oxygen, and that's a little bit, that plays a little different role, because we actually do become, despite the fact that the shoots are bathed in 21% oxygen. Um, it's very common to be oxygen depleted in the root zone for a variety of reasons, physiologically and soil chemistry wise. But in fact, I most of the time when I do a lot of consulting, and I almost always, it's number one. I've got compaction and I've got oxygen depletion in the root zone. And so, how do we deal with that? Well, we deal with it with aeration, and, which drives down the organic matter. And, but that's not necessarily harmful for these systems with sand-based sports fields and golf greens.
It's I think we could manage the turf better, and we can address the real problems. I like to address things in a logical way and address the real problem. So if we have a compaction problem, I don't want to try to solve that by carbon fertilizer. If we don't have enough nitrogen, if we have a bad mowing quality or something, we should like identify what the real problems are. And the to me, it's quite unfortunate when people are concerned about carbon fertilization, when the grass itself is a carbon capturing and organic matter production factory. That, and as you wrote in the article, you said that's their mission in life. And I made some calculations. I'd read Dr. Bob Caro wrote an article for the Golf Course Management magazine. I'll put a direct link to that in the show notes also. I think back in the 90s, and I took some notes here. He said 660 pounds per acre of new humus per year is produced by turf grass. And in total, if you look at what's typical, he said you'd have about 16,000 pounds per acre of humus, of which about half of that, he said, would be humic acid. 16,000 pounds per acre in a turfgrass root zone. I'm not so. I wanted to check for myself just on an exact carbon basis and doing in metric, which I'm a little bit more familiar with now. So I calculated what a 0.1% change in soil organic matter would be in terms of carbon, which 1 gram per kilogram would be 0.1%. So if we went from like 1% organic matter in the turfgrass root zone to 1.1%, and that turns out to be 70 grams of carbon per square meter in the top 4 inches, in the top 10 centimeters. That's 700 kilograms per hectare more carbon. That's carbon just by going from 1% to 1.1%, or from 2% to 2.1%. That's 14 pounds of carbon per 1,000 square feet in the top 4 inches. And that's
Yeah.
610 pounds per acre of carbon. And so I was like, wow. So those numbers were way bigger than I expected. So then I double checked the math. and then I double check the math again, and then I'm like, wow, that's a lot, because it's normal for turf grasses for the first 30 years of stand establishment to be accumulating the organic matter. You mentioned that where you tend to see a response might be in very early establishment before there's much organic matter in the soil. But as that organic matter, which is 58% carbon, builds up in the soil, I don't know that carbon fertilizer is something that it should not be on people's minds. Just get it out of your mind and think about managing things that actually have an effect. That's my math contribution to this.
Yeah, I'll just say that that math's important because a lot of times these products are being said, go put on a quart per acre. I mean, you're you're adding just a tiny drop of carbon in a huge ocean of carbon, and so now however, I will admit though that when I first started doing research on humic acid, basically was using that same math, and I was thinking there is no way that it's going to make an impact, and then I was wrong. I started doing it and I said, okay. But the key is that we were combining that humic acid with phosphorus, with the fertilizer before it was applied. So it was bonded, and then yeah, in some ways I was shocked that the humic acid actually worked in that situation. But I was also going to say, if, in relation to something else you said, so I teach a turfgrass science class, and I teach an urban soil and water management class at BYU. And one of the things I like to do is I like to do a little research and kind of get my students thinking about how research is done. And so one of the things that we do every year is I will get a bunch of soils, and we will compare, or a soil, it's a bunch of pots of a soil, and then I'll compact it tremendously. And then we will go out, and I'll have the students go out and find it. I'll say, go find products that claim that they're going to aerate the soil. And there's all kinds of them. And a lot of these do double duty as carbon fertilizers. Like they're claiming carbon fertilization, and it's going to aerate, and it's going to add microbial life, just kind of these big promises. It's going to cure everything except cancer. And so we'll apply them at those rates, and then I'll have the students go in and measure. It's like, okay, did it actually aerate the soil? And no surprise, it doesn't. They don't. I mean, you're trying to solve a physical problem with a chemical. That just doesn't work typically. Sometimes if I add a strong acid, or if I just inject acid, I can dissolve some limestone that's in the pores. So that's maybe one time where a chemical might help with oxygen deprivation in the soil, in the root zone. But I just want to say it, it's like, let's make sure I can't remember exactly how you said it, but let's make sure we're addressing the problem and not trying to say, let's add carbon fertilization and it's going to solve my aeration problems. No, you need to aerate your soil. And that's it. Aerate and top dress is the best solution. We don't have anything that's better than that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a perfect way to wrap this up, is to advise people, if because the people watching or listening to this are obviously turfgrass professionals or turfgrass aficionados, and I think I would advise to find out what the real problems are and address them. And I'm glad that you concur with that.
Amen.
So, yeah. Well, anything else that you would like to share or add before we say goodbay?
No, I think I've said it all. Again, it's great to meet you. Respect your work. I listen to your podcasts, and it's good to connect.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Hopkins. It has been a great pleasure having you on the show. And maybe we can talk again about humic acid and carbon stuff. I know this isn't going away. Us talking about this and you writing that article doesn't take those products off the shelf, and it doesn't stop that line of thinking that just tends to resonate with people, that somehow carbon is good, so adding it as fertilizer must be good. And I think both of us would try to be logical about it and continue explaining it. So maybe in the future we can talk again, and I look forward to meeting you in person sometime.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank
All
you.
right. Everyone, thank you for listening. Thanks for watching. I will sign off now for ATC from Trang, Thailand. I'm Micah Woods. Bye-bye.